Hello everyone and welcome back to the Ambassadors of Gaming channel. I'm Ambassador Michael and I am going to do a final review of Resident Evil Village, in which we recently put up our impressions and in which Adam will finalize our thoughts and feelings kind of on Resident Evil Village with an end cap piece regarding how it ties into the series and kind of where we think the series will go from there. But this is solely about the review of the game as a whole,
Gotta do a deep
taking
clean
it
before Rose
as
starts
its own.
walking around.
So there are a couple of pieces I'm going to hit on
Everyone's
here.
forgotten about this
I'm going to
already.
hit on the level design, the horror elements of the game, the gameplay itself, and the story. And I'll try to avoid certain elements because I think Adam will recover them again in his video anyways, so there's no sense in going them over here. So regarding the level design, we have a couple different areas that are going to be seen throughout. The Castle Dimitrescu, House Beneviento, which is a smaller horror-based area, the Lake, which is the third boss area, the Stronghold, the Factory, and the Village. And so, Castle Dimitrescu is well designed, and honestly, such a joy to explore, as well as its upper and lower level areas. The vampiric aesthetic is really nice and different, as well as it being very clean and proper compared to the normally very grotesque areas we see in Resident Evil. There are areas with some more disturbing imagery, but it is much more relaxed here than it is in Resident Evil 7 and the others. The other two areas, the Lake and the Stronghold, I don't really want to hit on too much because while they offer some interesting gameplay elements, I don't think there's too much to say here that isn't said about the Castle and Beneviento. They're well designed, albeit shorter areas with some interesting objectives and fights. House Beneviento, however, is a more horror-based, puzzle-based aesthetic. So what you're going to do in that area is a lot of puzzle solving, a lot of exploration, that type of stuff, and it will actually force you to do so without using your equipment. So I thought that it was a nice change of pace from what we see in Resident Evil 7, which I felt was more back and forth puzzles, puzzle, action, horror, that kind of stuff, whereas this is each area is very different, and you get a different type of experience from each area. House Beneviento, I think, is the most horror-based element, most classic Resident Evil that we get from this game itself. So the Factory is the biggest area in the game, and we only get three really large areas in the game, the first being the village itself, the castle, and then the factory. The factory, I think, is incredibly well designed, and while it isn't as big as Castle Dimitrescu, it feels so much bigger due to the way the building is designed with more open areas
Just
and tight
making
corridors.
sure it's locked.
This also kind of allows you
She's going
to
to
have a
go
different sense of
beautiful.
scale in comparison to the castle. Regarding the horror elements of the game, the item placement, I think, is much more deliberate than in Resident Evil 7. There's obviously a lot more of it because the game is so much larger, but
She's asleep.
they're also not as hidden. The lockpicks return from previous games as well as 7, and there's not that many of them throughout, but again, it's one of those scenarios where there aren't enough lockpicks in a single playthrough to pick all of the locks, so you have to be careful with certain choices that you make regarding the lockpicks. The monster design of the game overall I thought was pretty good. I thought there was a good variety in what the monsters were, how they acted, how they behaved, how the AI was designed. I thought that the movement in particular was pretty good. I think it was a little bit more improved than what we saw in 7 with the molded. The molded are very jittery. Here you have different types of enemies, and because of the different types of enemies, their movements are much different, their designs are much different, and as well the way that you deal with them is much different. So the guns and the gameplay itself feel pretty well balanced out for the most part. Certain enemies do seem to die faster or not as quickly depending on the gun you use. It seems certain ones are better against other enemies than others, but overall it feels fairly balanced. The inventory system itself is a return from the style of Resident Evil 4, and I actually thought it worked fairly well here. It felt really balanced and pretty fair. I never felt like I didn't have enough space for the type of loadout that I wanted, the level of items I wanted, ammo, health, bombs and mines, that type of stuff. Overall, I felt like I always had enough space for what I needed to do during the game on my first playthrough. Exploration is worthwhile and I think pays off big time in this game. Pretty much any time you go off the beaten path, there's usually something worthwhile for you to find and get.
Gotta do a deep clean before
one of those things can even be the cooking elements of the game, which kind of return from 4 and 5, where 4 and 5 was more about like the eggs that you would find from the snakes or the chickens. But here, when you find the animals, you can kill them and you can get meat, and this allows you to get certain upgrades that increase your health, the amount of damage that you block with the block, faster movement speed. Very worthwhile upgrades, as well as unique animals that you need to complete the better upgrades. There's 3 unique animals, 1 for each type. There's a unique chicken, a unique bird, a unique, I think it's a boar or a pig, and I think that's it. So I think there's 3 types. There's poultry, fish, and game, which is just pretty much pigs and goats and that kind of stuff. But overall, those were really worthwhile to get. I'm really glad that I explored and found most of them in my first playthrough, and it was really worthwhile. The crafting system here as well feels more balanced than in Resident Evil 7, mostly because it feels like you have a lot of choice. You have to buy the recipes, unlike you did in 7, where you just kind of unlock them as you go. But they feel worthwhile because you can craft almost anything in any scenario. Obviously, on your first playthrough, you will likely run into the scenario of I can either create this or I can create that, which is very classic Resident Evil, and it felt very worthwhile to engage with on a regular basis. It felt worthwhile to go out of my way to collect the materials I needed to craft and all that kind of stuff. The pipe bombs and the mines are welcome returns here. They work really well with a lot of the enemies, the bosses, and they do really help you navigate environments. I think one of the things that Resident Evil typically does fairly well is it allows you to pace backwards while you're shooting at an enemy. That's very typical in these types of games. And the mines are really helpful with that because you can, if you feel like there's many enemies chasing you or something like that, you can place a mine. You can quickly turn around, run away, and get a few of them in one go. Or the same with the pipe bomb. You can quickly change to it with the shortcuts if you have it equipped and throw them right in there. The variety of guns feels really thought out, though I'm not such a huge fan of the multiple types of the same gun when there really isn't that much of a big difference, other than they look different and their stats are higher. For example, the shotguns are more or less the same. They just get stronger and they shoot a little bit faster, but it's not like there's such a significant difference between the way that they shoot that it much matters. It's one of the limitations of the game where the first shotgun you get is very weak in comparison to the last shotgun you get, though it doesn't shoot much faster, but it does hold more. So it's these types of trade-offs that I felt like were a little bit difficult to deal with, mostly because I think they're more designed for the people who will play this game multiple times like myself, versus if you play through one time, you might be better off just sticking with the guns, the type that you like. If you find a handgun you really like, just stick with that one and upgrade it, versus continuously upgrading different ones to different levels if you don't plan on replaying the game. Regarding the story, I have a few points here that I felt were really worthwhile getting into, mostly about Ethan. He's much more elaborated on here and feels like a character that is much more developed. He talks about his pain and his trauma, how much he wants to save his daughter, and how he feels about the characters he's dealing with throughout the game. While he does have a few jokes thrown in here and there, they don't feel as forced as in the other games, but sometimes they do feel a bit unnecessary. To summarize the story, Ethan must get his daughter back from Chris after he kidnaps her and he shoots Mia. Ethan wakes up in the village and he must start to clear out the pieces of the village and the surrounding areas to find his daughter. So after clearing the castle, we learn that Rose, his daughter, has been split into 4 parts, and we must collect them to return her to normal. This begins our quest with the boss, and kind of leads us down the path with each boss fight. And each boss fight at the end usually will award us with a piece of Rose, which we will then try to use to put her back together. So I've mentioned each area of the game so far and kind of what they're like. The boss fights overall I thought were fairly decent. I think that the only one I really had complaints about were the Lady Dimitrescu and that Moranu, I think is his name, is the lake boss. I thought that they were too similar in terms of their weak points. They both have this like crystallized body coming out of their monster form, which is common in other Resident Evils, that there's a human body coming out of the monster form. But it always kind of feels like a weird weak point to decide to make. Like if it wasn't necessarily the weak point, I wouldn't really mind as much, but it seems to be where they take the most damage. So I felt like using that twice was a little lazy, but overall their designs are very different from each other, and the way that you interact with them and beat them is very different. And I thought that all the bosses overall were fairly interesting, though the Heisenberg boss at the end with this like makeshift tank felt a little strange to me. It could have been interesting, but it's just kind of done in a weird way, and I didn't enjoy it as much as the other fights, personally. And then the Chris section of the game is near the end. There's a section where you play as Chris, and it feels really like weird that it's kind of in there. It feels like kind of jarring. They make it make sense with the story, but with the terms of like going from Ethan and this established character, and you have like your setup and everything, to like this totally different character with different weapons and different equipment and different items. It's very weird, especially near like the end of the game. It just kind of felt like a weird change of pace that wasn't as necessary. But I don't know how I guess I would rectify that. So that's why I'm not as harsh on it as I think some other people have been. Because if they wanted to tell the story that they're telling, that's probably the best way to do it. However, it just feels really weird. Especially the laser. There's a laser that you have to use to beat an environment section, and then you can use the same laser to beat this boss. That's pretty cool. Near the end of his campaign. And then the end of the game is with the fight with Mother Miranda, who is the leader of the 4 horsemen that we have fought along the way, and we are going to save Rose. So the end of the game brings us to more or less how and why it's all happening. The biggest spoilers here, obviously. To keep things short, Mother Miranda found the Mutamycete, the mold from Resident Evil 7, in this village after the Spanish flu around 1919, in which her daughter was killed. The mold is now canonically after the Las Plagas in terms of when bioweapons were created or discovered. I might be off on that, but we'll find out when Adam does his video. I think I'm correct in that, as it being the second oldest bioweapon now. The Mutamycete is this natural fungus that seems to retain a hive mind, like Evelyn from Resident Evil 7. However, it seems to have formed naturally and absorbed the memories of the people that have died and been buried near it and its roots. So the Mutamycete basically gave Evelyn her powers with the genetic sequencing they did in RE7 with the collective, and that kind of circles all back in how 7 and this game 8 and Village are connected. Miranda believes that Rose can be imprinted with the consciousness of her dead daughter and bring her back to life. She believes this due to the big twist of the game, that Rose is actually the byproduct of a molded human like herself and a full human. It being revealed that when Ethan was actually killed in Resident Evil 7, when he was captured by Jack Baker, he was killed and converted into a molded. But like Miranda, he retained his more natural form and didn't succumb to Evelyn's complete control. From my perspective, why certain people are chosen by the Mutamycete to retain the form in humanity seems to be unclear. I didn't do a super deep dive into that, but based off of the lore in the game, I didn't see anything that pointed out why that would be. And to wrap up on the Four Horsemen and the Lycans and everything else, it's all more or less explained as Miranda's experiments with the Mutamycete and a parasite she creates. So, but again, I feel like that's better suited for the video that Adam wants to do, kind of rounding out the story of these. The game wraps up with us finding out that Mia was actually not Mia from the beginning, but instead Miranda, who was able to shapeshift and change form, and that Mia was instead captured many months before that. Chris plants a bomb on the root of the Mutamycete, which Ethan then uses after he kills Miranda's form and she merges with the root. He destroys the root with the bomb, and after everyone has been evacuated, basically Mia, Chris, and Rose, and the root is destroyed, which unfortunately kills Ethan as well, seeing as he is made of Mutamycete and a mold himself. So overall, I feel like the game delivers an experience that is worthwhile for you to play. I think it fits in really well with 7. I'm not sure based on the ending of this game with the time skip, because Ethan dies, there's a time skip that shows Rose at the end as a full-grown adult, how that will kind of fit in with the next game. But I'll leave that for Adam to more or less figure out and have him explain it to me. But overall, I felt like I really, really enjoyed this game. I had a lot of fun with it from moment to moment to moment. I enjoyed the story. I thought the villains were really well thought out and developed, and their motivations really seemed to make sense within Miranda's kind of coven. Why they each have their own objectives, what they want to do, why they want to fit in with her, why they're with her, aligned with her in the first place, that kind of stuff. And I enjoyed Ethan's overall story, though I am sad to see it being concluded here because out of all the Resident Evil games I've played, I enjoyed Ethan the most as a character, so I'm very sad to see his story end. And it's part of the reason it's been difficult for me to want to do this review, because it feels like an end cap for me, recognizing that his story is indeed over. And I wish that maybe I had gotten more time with his character before they progressed into this next arc. It seems like they're going in with Rose. So, overall, I think Resident Evil Village is worthwhile to play. I think if you haven't experienced the other Resident Evil games, this will connect with you and you will enjoy it, but I think you will get the most out of it if you have at least played 7. I think you will get the most out of it if you have played all of them, or at least the ones with Chris in them. But it's more or less to be expected from the game that is supposedly the numbered 8th sequel. It's not numbered, but it is the 8th entry in the series of the mainline series. So overall, I think this is probably one of the strongest games we're going to get this year. This is the game I was looking most forward to this year. And as of right now, it's the best game I've played this year. Graphically, gameplay, the story overall I thought was fairly strong. So I think it's a Game of the Year contender as well. And I think it overall was worth the $60 price point that I ended up paying on Xbox, because I played through on the Series X. So overall, Resident Evil Village, a worthwhile experience, something I think many of you should enjoy and play. However, I don't feel like maybe it's the best entry point into the series. I think if you're going to start Resident Evil for the first time, maybe start with 7 if you don't feel like playing the previous games. So that's pretty much all I have to say on the game itself. I'd love to know what you thought of the game. This is obviously the spoiler discussion, so everything and anything here I expect you to spoil, so of course it's fine by me. And yeah, I'll see you all in the next video.